My name is Mensun Bound. I'm a maritime archaeologist. I come from the Falkland Islands. I've been excavating, surveying, evaluating shipwrecks all my adult life. I directed my first underwater expedition when I was in my 20s, back in the very early 80s. And for 32 consecutive years, that means every year I was excavating shipwrecks of all types, all periods, all over the world. And these days, things are a little bit different because now I'm working with robots, deep ocean technology, and it's a whole new sphere of archaeology. This year, I directed the deepest underwater excavation there's ever been. We're over 5,000 meters down, and I'm so proud of the work we did. It was incredibly exciting, but we demonstrated that we can work at that kind of depth using robots. But more than that, thanks to laser scan technology, we were able to map and control our work with such precision that the work we were doing was better than anything I ever did in shallow work, in shallow depths with divers. And that, to my mind, is just utterly incredible. Yeah, we do have this rather tenuous connection to Shackleton. Shackleton was in the Falkland Islands 3 times. And on the last time, he fell out with the governor, and he usually stayed with the governor. But on this occasion, he wasn't allowed to stay there anymore in Government House. So he ended up in a place called the First and Last. It was kind of a bar and bedding establishment on the waterfront in Port Stanley. And he and Worsley and Tom Crean, well, they stayed there. And we have in the family the visitors book, and it's got Shackleton's signature in it. It's got Worsley's signature in it, who was the captain of the Endurance, and it's got the great Irishman Tom Crean, his signature in it. And one of those 3 did a little picture of a penguin. We don't know which of the 3 did it, but it's there. It's absolutely fabulous. So yeah, growing up, the Shackleton story was something which was in my family. And I have to say this: the story goes that he never paid his bills. So, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but that's the story that's been passed down my family. Failure, when you're bestriding projects which literally cost millions, many millions, the whole prospect of failure is something that just ties your tripes up in knots. And yes, our first expedition to find the Endurance ended up in failure. You can't sugarcoat it in any other way. It was bad. Our AUV, our autonomous underwater vehicle, which is our principal search vehicle, that came up under the ice, under one of the flows. And then we had to spend 3 days using the ship as a kind of chopper to whack our way into that flow to get the AUV out. And then the next day we were wet testing our ROV. ROV is a remote operated vehicle. So if we found the Endurance, that was what we're going to use to map it. Our ROV imploded. It hadn't even reached crush depth, and yet the damn thing imploded. And eventually we got the search going. We got into the search box, and for a while, actually, it was going really well. Our AUV that was doing the searching was performing well. We'd meet up with it every few hours for what we call a handshake. It's a rendezvous, right? And we sort of interrogate the various systems on the vehicle and make sure they're all performing to expectation. And then we release it and it carries on the search. Okay, so we covered half the search box, and then we don't know to this day what happened, but it did not turn up for its rendezvous. We spent 2 days pinballing around in the ice, trying to make contact with it. And in the end, we had to get out of there because the ice was getting really aggressive. It was coiling around us. It was like, it felt like we were within the coils of a boa constrictor, if you like. It was that bad. Winter was down upon us. The temperatures had plummeted, and we just had to get out of there. And I had to go back to London with my tail between my legs and explain it all to the person who drove the whole mission in London. It wasn't a good time. But sometimes, you have to fail to succeed. And we learned a lot from our failure. We learned how to work with the ice. When we went in the second time, we let the ice, as it were, impose its will on us. What I mean by that is we use satellite technology to try and find a flow which was traveling in the right direction, that it was the right thickness of ice, and it was traveling at the right speed. And when those three things came together, we would drive the ship into that flow about, I don't know, 3 or 4 ships' lengths, and we'd position ourselves about 2 or 3 cables updrift of where we wanted to deploy our equipment. And then as we fell over the spot, as the current carried us over the zone, then we released the search vehicle. And this is all, I should say, not thanks to me. This is all a way of working that was devised by the ice skipper on the ship, a guy called Freddie Ligthelm. And then what Freddie did was he put a little bit of power on one of the main engines, and that created just enough prop wash at the back of the ship to keep a pool around the stern absolutely clear of rogue ice. And the system worked to perfection. And we just dived our vehicle in and out of that pool for as long as we were there. It was utterly brilliant. And in the end, we succeeded. We found the Endurance. We only got in 2 dives on the Endurance because of the weather window we had. First dive was to secure the data. The second dive was the absolute high point, the pinnacle of my life as an archaeologist. That was the archaeological inspection dive. And there were just 4 of us in that little control room together. It was a tiny little room that we welded onto the back deck. There was myself, there was a guy on the sticks, there was a hydrographer and data analyst. Oh, and we had a photographer jammed in a corner there. And we just knew we were the luckiest guys in the world. We were going to see Sir Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance. And we defined a vector which would take us in on the stern of the ship. In other words, we're coming in on the same, if you like, the same bearing as the ship on the seabed. And I remember the first thing I saw, we just had one little light showing, because I didn't want to put on all the lights, because if we did that, we'd be sucking up battery like there's no tomorrow or something. So one tiny little light, and we went in, it was just really gloomy, and we got right up to the stern, and the first thing I saw was the ship's rudder. And that was awesome. That completely wowed me, because I wasn't expecting to see that. It was laying there flat on the seabed, because the story was, and this is well tested in the diaries and things, and Shackleton's own book, about how the end of the ship came when a flow ripped across the stern of the ship and tore the rudder right off the rudder post. And then they all said the rudder had gone. And yet there was the rudder right under the tuck of the stern. And you could see the wood where it had been splintered, where it had been torn away from the ship. But, the ship had fallen through 3,000 meters. And there was the rudder just laying there as innocently as you would like. That was a big surprise. And then we elevated the system. And then I said something like, okay, let's turn the lights on. And we turned all the lights on at once. And whoosh, like that, we illuminated, we flooded the entire stern of the Endurance. And that's when we saw the ship's name, 9 metallic raised letters arcing over the 5-pointed star, the Polaris star, after which the builders of the Endurance had originally named the ship. And it was just mind-blowing. It was just this moment of just raw, mind-drenching emotion. We were just, we were just so pumped at that moment. We could not believe it. And that was the instant when we took the epic shot of the ship's stern, which, went viral. Now you see it everywhere. It's iconic. And then this was an amazing moment. I found myself looking at 2 portholes. And I knew from my research that those 2 portholes were the portholes through to Shackleton's cabin. And I knew that on the other side of that wall, midway between those 2 portholes that I was looking at, that there was a fixed a wooden picture frame. And that within that wooden picture frame, there was a copy of Rudyard Kipling's poem, If. And I knew it was still there, and I knew it was still legible. And it was just utterly mind-blowing. And then we went from the stern, we went down the ship, looking, just studying. I was taking notes, and we finally got to the bow, but we saw some amazing things along the way. We saw there was a gun there. It was a handgun. It was a ship's flare gun, and that immediately brought to mind a story about, not a story. It happened. It's in the diaries. When Shackleton left the ship for the last time, he and who would have been? Let's see, the photographer Hurley, and there was a third. It would have been Wild, Shackleton's deputy. They went up on the poop deck. Shackleton took the flare gun. He put a detonator cap in it, and then he raised the gun and fired it in salute to the flag. And then he threw the gun down on the deck, and he left the ship and never went back on again. And I like to think that the last person to touch that gun was Shackleton. And then we found, and this is pretty mind-blowing too, we found 3 holes in the deck. And I remember it was the French data analyst. He said to me, "Look, Mensun, ice damage." And I said to him, no, that's not ice damage. Those are the holes which saved their lives. Because once they left the ship, they very quickly realized they didn't have enough food, enough supplies to keep them going for very long. And then Hurley, the photographer, realized that maybe, just maybe, they could cut through the deck. He said, my old cabin in the tween deck is absolutely stuffed with supplies. And if we could cut through the deck, we could probably get some of those supplies out. So working in ice up to their knees, they cut 3 holes in the deck. And over a period of 3 days, they extracted 3 tons of supplies. And that was the food that saved their lives. So it was very, very exciting. I mean, I was just, adjectives kind of escape you when you try to explain what it was like sort of exploring Shackleton's ship. But it was utterly, utterly just mind-blowing, the whole thing. I was buzzing from beginning to end. There's something within our species which has us always wanting to explore. And I knew that was there within me from a very early age. And next thing is, if you explore, then you have questions. And all the wrecks I ever worked on, I always had questions in my mind. How did it get there? What was it like? What was it carrying? What is the archaeology? What is the history around this wreck? And great stories. And these wrecks have a way of just bubbling up through history and inspiring and raising more questions and things like that. Things that you want to put before the next generation. And shipwrecks, they always have these incredibly exciting stories to tell. They wouldn't be there on the seabed if they didn't. And studying and retelling those stories is such a privilege, and I love doing it. And everything within ships, like the Endurance, they're like, the Endurance is this. What would you call it? It's like a time capsule. It's just a box. A King Tut's tomb full of wonderful things. Aladdin's cave full of mysteries and nautical objects and things like that. And it's just so exciting. And most of these shipwrecks, they have things like that on board, and I just love finding them and telling the stories and recording them. I've been very lucky I've been privileged to have a life like this. In the course of my life, I can't believe how things have changed. I grew up on a tiny little island in the Falkland Islands. We didn't have electricity. We didn't have vehicles of any kind. For lights in the evenings, we had oil lamp. Everything was done on horseback. We had schooners to get around in. And here I am at the back end of my life, and I'm using autonomous underwater vehicles and robots to excavate. And, it's just utterly incredible how far we've come in such a short time. And the future is so, so exciting. I can't even begin to imagine, 50 years from now, what technology will be available, what conservation techniques and processes will be available. The whole future for the underwater world is just utterly brilliant.